Welcome to the Environmental Education and Civic Engagement online expert panel. My name is Alex, I'm at Cornell University, and today we have with us five really amazing, knowledgeable experts, panelists, who will share their insights and ideas about how environmental education can foster and integrate civic engagement so that we can build a more equitable and sustainable world. I'd like to acknowledge support from the US EPA, North American Association for Environmental Education, and its professional development program for environmental educators called EE360. We will begin with five presentations.
Yeah, hi Alex, hi everyone. So I'm speaking to you from Galicia, which is in the northwest of Spain. This is where I grew up. But over the last 17 years, I've been based in Scotland. I work there at the University of Edinburgh. I work on issues to do with democracy, democratic reform, democratic innovation, and the role that citizens must play in trying to work out how we're going to turn the world around and move towards more desirable futures. So that's my main area of interest, and of course climate action, environmental justice and so on are some of the key issues we're working on. So I'm just really grateful to be here, and I don't get to do many things in the States, so delighted to be here. So should I just crack on with my presentation? Yeah, cool.
Absolutely.
Yeah, let's go. I guess I want to start by acknowledging the obvious, which is that in many ways we are trapped by a lot of the habits and ways of thinking and ways of doing that we are carrying with us from the past century, and that are trapping us in a very narrow imagination about what the world can be and should be. So in many ways, I like to look at the climate and ecological crisis as crisis of political, economic, and public imagination. A crisis of political imagination because our existing systems of governance are struggling to think long-term and act with urgency right now. A lack of imagination in how we can organize ourselves to try and tackle the challenges of our time. And leaders of all kinds are really struggling in terms of both legitimacy to act and capacity to act. Then a crisis of economic imagination because we've built economic systems that are just too focused on extraction, expropriation, accumulation, exploitation, and of course this makes it really difficult to reorganize economic life so that it's compatible with well-being for people and planet. And a crisis of public imagination because we've kind of been persuaded that this is the only way we can organize things, that this is the kind of economy that is possible, that this is the kind of political organization that is possible, that democracy is what we have rather than something that is somewhere in the future but we haven't quite accomplished, at least in terms of a deep form of democracy. Next, please. So we happen to be in the middle of this deepening climate and ecological crisis at the same time that we are in the middle of a democratic recession. Since the financial crash in 2008, we have spoken a lot about economic recession and all of that, but in parallel to that, there is a worsening democratic recession, and this is a global phenomenon. Next, Alex. So I'm not going to go through all the indicators, but these are some of the headlines of that democratic recession. We find ourselves losing democratic systems around the world at a pace that we haven't seen for many decades. And there is a surge in autocratic regimes. There is also a rise in pro-democracy resistance. So these things go hand in hand, of course. But there is also an increasing level of authoritarian attitudes, including amongst young people, and we should be very worried about that. Part of it has to do with frustration and impatience in terms of the lack of meaningful, substantial, and powerful climate action. And that is driving people to all kind of undesirable ideas about, benign eco-dictators and things like that, which are quite terrible. I come from a country that had a real dictatorship for 40 years, so I don't take it lightly, all this flirting with authoritarian values that seems to be proliferating so much. Now, when we ask people across the world, the idea of democracy remains popular. People like the ideas, the principles. Well, what people are disenchanted with is how democracy is practiced. And we have a growing gap, which Dalton has mapped across the world, between the politically rich and the politically poor, those who know how to influence the decisions that affect their lives and those who don't. And those power inequalities then feed all kinds of other inequalities, including environmental inequalities. So for me, a key question at the intersection of environmental education and civic engagement is the question of what kind of citizen are citizens invited to be. And very often they are invited to be spectators, complainers, bystanders, rather than co-producers, thinkers, problem solvers. So we need to reimagine democracy so that it can accommodate a more co-productive form of governance. So that's the case for democratic reform and innovation. We do need to keep advancing democracy because otherwise we enter stagnation. Now, that's the whole point of the field that I work on. It's called the field of democratic innovation. Democratic innovations are processes or institutions that are developed to reimagine and to deepen the role that citizens play in democratic governance by including opportunities to participate, deliberate, and exercise influence. There are lots of democratic innovations, lots of large families of very diverse processes of democratic innovation. I'm just going to offer one example before I finish. Next, please. And that's the example of climate assemblies, which are a really good example in the case of this event because they are designed to combine environmental education and civic engagement. Climate assemblies are new, but the family of democratic innovations they belong to, which we call mini publics, are not new. Because we have had citizens' juries, planning cells, deliberative polls, and all kinds of other deliberative types of processes for the last 50 years. But climate assemblies are now spreading fast across the world. Next, please. Actually, you were going in the right direction, Alex, there. In Scotland, for example, we have had our Scottish Climate Assembly, and again it follows the model that is proliferating, where people are selected through civic lottery so that you have a cross-section of the relevant population. Then people get the opportunity to learn about environmental issues, about environmental policies, about all kinds of challenges, and then they engage in deliberation that leads to informed recommendations and ideally to climate action. If you want to see more examples, I recommend the NOCA website, the Knowledge Network on Climate Assemblies. Next, this is my last slide, just some quick reflections. A lot of the task, in my mind, at the intersection of environmental education and civic engagement is about reversing the narrowing of the public imagination that has constrained democratic life to a very narrow set of practices. We need to recognize, as John Dewey, for example, the great American thinker, framed it, that democracy should permeate all social, cultural, and economic relations. It has to be more than electoral democracy. Politics is more than party politics, and the economy is a key part of democratic life and therefore needs to be more democratic. None of this is new to the environmental movement and to environmental education, but what is new and what is different about these democratic innovations that I'm introducing is that they try to build a bridge between the streets and the institutions. It's not just about what we do on the streets and in demonstrations and in civic organizing and community action of all kinds. As important as that is, it's also about translating some of that into policy action, public action, collective action through new institutions designed to do that. And what we know, what we have learned in the field of democratic innovation is that citizens are more than ready to take up those roles. When the right conditions are in place, they can grapple with really complex issues and make good, well-informed decisions and generating public goods of all kinds. So we enter, and this is my last point, we enter, in my mind, and in the field of democratic innovation, an era of accelerated experimentalism. We are in a rush. We need to get these things working. And they are indeed. There are thousands of examples all over the world. But we need to recognize that they are not perfect. And some of these democratic innovations are beautiful failures. Others are troubled successes. We need to remain critical without becoming cynical. And hopefully learn how to build those new institutions that have that very difficult task of taking urgent short-term action that is based on long-term thinking. So thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for putting together this panel, Alex. It's really wonderful to be here. So I'm the Senior Manager for Climate Resilience Education Programs at the National Wildlife Federation. We're a national conservation nonprofit. And I specialize in designing whole community climate resilience education programs, like the Resilient Schools and Communities program that I am currently working on now, that educates students about climate science, climate impacts, climate justice, and resiliency solutions. And the program is being adapted in New Jersey, Texas, Puerto Rico. It's been adapted in the US Virgin Islands. And I'm also the founder of the Climate Resilience Education Task Force, which is an intergenerational coalition of educators, students, NGOs, and others that are working to expand access to climate education across New York. You can go ahead. Thanks. So the Climate Resilience Education Task Force, which is the work that I'll be talking about today, the motivation for the group was really to essentially try to reverse the trend of the lack of climate education in our state. And right now, we know that students are receiving about 1 to 2 hours of climate instruction per school year, which is really tragic given the situation that we find ourselves in. And moreover, that in the United States, every state has its own standards, policies, curriculum, and standards. And so there is no uniformity across the country. And so it's a state-by-state situation, which makes reform very difficult. And I really liked what Oliver was saying about reversing the something of public imagination, the limits of public imagination and accelerating experimentation. I think that we are in a time when we really have to disrupt current institutions that are not serving us. And I know that the youth believe that, and they see that, and they are actively, in the streets telling us that they are not satisfied with the current system. And that applies also to education. The education system that we are dealing with is not flexible, is not responsive to the urgency of this moment, and it is not providing students with the education that they need and deserve to address the climate crisis. And so we know, for example, that millions of students around the world are facing educational disruptions as a result of the climate crisis. They are not able to go to school either because of extreme storms, mudslides, earthquakes, hurricanes, and the school systems are not really adapting to that situation. We also know that a majority of young people are increasingly anxious about their futures in a climate crisis world, and that teachers really want to teach about this, but they don't feel equipped because they don't have the proper training. We also know that students are typically, when they do receive climate instruction, they're learning about the problems of the crisis and how it came about, but they're not learning about the solutions, and they really desperately want to. And certainly for New York State, we know that from Yale research that 81% of New Yorkers support the teaching of climate in school, including the solutions. And so that has motivated our strategy for what we're working on now. Next slide, please. So we decided we were looking at different climate education bills across the country, some successful and some not, and decided to look at the language in the most successful examples. And we decided to draft our own climate education bill. Students had an input into it. And so what we're asking for in New York State is updated lesson exemplars so that teachers understand that they can integrate climate into their current classrooms across all grades and disciplines, because right now the standards are really unclear and they don't even include the words climate change. So teachers that don't have the training don't understand that they can actually teach about it. We also are asking for training for teachers, for both pre-service and in-service teachers, aligned to a schedule that supports our state's Climate Act, which is basically saying that we need to decarbonize by 2040. We need to have zero emission electricity by 2040, and yet we don't have any kind of education that is bringing us to that goal. We want the education resources to be free and available, and we want technical assistance for teachers. We also are asking for the establishment of new green career and technical education programs for high school students, because while we're hopefully moving in the direction of renewable energy in our state, we don't have any training programs for high school students that let them know that that's the direction we're moving in, and these programs should be creating this pipeline to the green jobs that we're all talking about. We also are asking for a coordinating Office of Climate Education, which is something that New Jersey has already done, our neighbor. New Jersey has already mandated climate education across all grades and content areas. So we're basically trying to play catch up to our neighbor in New Jersey. Next slide, please. So what we basically have done is throughout January, February, and March, we organized intergenerational lobby days to our state capital in Albany, New York, bringing students and adults from across the state to lobby their elected representatives in support of this climate education bill that the students actually helped to write. And so one of our young students, Ellery Spikes, who's now a high school senior, was very active in helping to organize this. She booked appointments with elected officials ahead of our trips. We also prepared packets of memos of support. We had over 65 organizations supporting the bill and hundreds of educators. We had prepared bios of the legislators they were meeting with, so they knew the history of their voting records. And we matched minor students with adult chaperones so that everybody felt safe. And we did pre-lobby day training so that everyone felt confident in speaking about the bill and practiced elevator pitches. Next slide, please. And so at each of the appointments with these legislators, we made sure that students were able to share their stories about their lack of climate education in school. And in most cases, this was the first time that students had traveled to their state capital to engage in discussions with their elected representatives. Next slide, please. And in all cases, the representatives and their staff were extremely supportive of the students. They were happy to speak with them. They were happy to listen to them. And in some cases, the staff that we met with, because we weren't always meeting with the actual senator or assembly member, we were meeting with staff. And many times the staff seemed like recent college graduates themselves. And so they were more like peers to our students. And they often shared their own lack of climate education in their school experience, which really created this bond between the students and the people they were meeting with. And then the adult chaperones also bonded with their student charges and acted as mentors to them throughout the day. Next slide, please. And the students also got to bond with each other. So in this particular photo on the left, Caroline in the front is 7 years old, and she got to meet high school students. And then the young lady on the left was my intern, who's a college freshman at New York University. One day we also had a 4-year-old because a parent came with us and brought her daughter. So there was a wide range of ages in all of our meetings. And We had a gentleman who was in his 70s, so we had a really wide range of ages, and it was a really wonderful intergenerational supportive space. And the kids had fun together, which was really the most important thing. Next slide, please. So throughout the year, the students also had meetings with elected leaders. They met with both state senators and assembly members, and they also met with staff from the New York City mayor's office and the governor's office. And this slide shows a meeting we had with the mayor's office where students were advocating for climate education to be included in our city's strategic plan. Plan NYC Getting Sustainability Done was published in April 2023, and for the first time included 10 pages on climate education and green workforce development, which was a historic first, and our students helped to make that happen. Yeah, so if you're interested in more information about our task force, that's our website and email where you can get in touch.
Thanks so much. I'm super grateful to be on the panel, and really just so excited by everything I'm hearing so far. My name is Amari Beji. I use she, her pronouns, and I serve as the Director of Policy with the Maine Environmental Education Association. I have a really great privilege of centering participatory justice by engaging Maine youth in legislative and government relations, policy and advocacy efforts, so that youth can really take charge of their education. I don't actually come from a background of policy and advocacy. I come from a background of community science and environmental science research. What really allowed me to come to this work was a really powerful experience that I had as a young person. I'm still a young person though, as a younger person. And I wanted to really share that with you all, to share just how a legislative pathway, which is similar to the work that Emily led in New York, is a really powerful tool and exemplifies how there can be a powerful intersection of civic engagement, equitable engagement of youth in their environmental futures. Next slide, please. So in 2020, I had a lot of time on my hands at the beginning of the pandemic. I was a high school student, and I was involved in community science efforts and environmental science research, and was really looking to bring my environmental education to scale. It was something that was super impactful on my life and has totally changed the trajectory of my life. And so I really wanted to have that centered in more education systems across Maine. And so I joined the Nature-Based Education Consortium's working group on climate education, policy, and advocacy. I was just really grateful to connect with folks across the state of Maine who were also really passionate about climate education. But then also we had a similar experience of not really having this in our K through 12 experiences in public schools. And this wasn't just youth like myself, it was a youth-led group, and we had youth co-chairs. But it was also teachers and informal educators. So we had a really robust and diverse perspective represented in this group. We spent our first few months building trust with each other, and didn't really realize that we'd have an opportunity so fast for actually influencing policy. And that was through our state's climate action plan that was passed in December of 2020. So we wrote recommendations for climate education in this climate action plan, and they actually made it as part of the Maine Won't Wait, which is pictured on the screen here. So that was a huge success, and some motivation to continue the work forward in advocating for climate literacy in Maine. Next slide, please. So the next thing that we did was we actually organized a climate summit. And this was over 200 folks across Maine who convened over Zoom over the course of 2 weeks to envision and share about what is the current landscape of climate literacy in Maine, and then also where are we going, where would we like to go? And so we had these breakout sessions that we called Vision Labs, where folks envisioned what they would like to see for Maine. And so we heard a lot from both students and teachers that there were needs for professional development funding for educators around climate education. And so this was also data that was supported by the 2019 community-based census for environmental learning. So we had a stakeholder convening from folks in our community, and we also had data that drove forward what we conceptualized as part of this climate education campaign. Next slide. And so with that information, we met as a working group in 2021, and we had a retreat over some really wonderful tacos. We decided that we were going to have a legislative campaign. I had never been to the State House before. I'd never testified. I didn't even know what lobbying was. And that was the case for a lot of folks in our group. Where we had an intergenerational group, it was really powerful to have folks who were who serve as lobbyists, who had more experience in policy and advocacy, where we as youth could lend our stories and our lived experience of this lacking education. They actually could facilitate those connections for us with legislators, with other folks in government. And so that was a really crucial piece and part of this recipe for our later success. There were some hurdles as well. First being that this was a shorter session, so everything was under a super compressed timeline. And a lot of the bills don't actually make it through the short session. The Legislative Council votes to not have, I think it's about 80% or so of bills not make it through. And that was actually the first iteration of LD 1902. It didn't make it through, but we mobilized and we had a teach-in where we said, this bill is to provide professional development. It's a professional development grant program. It is not a mandate. Maine is a local control state with education. So folks are pretty opposed to mandates. So we made sure to stay clear of that. And so with that, we actually had the decision overturned and the bill went through and was now being considered as part of the full session. Next slide, please. And so the next piece was the committee hearings. This was my first time testifying, a lot of people's first time testifying. With the community support we garnered, we had over 100 pieces of positive testimony. We had no testimony in opposition, lots from educators, lots from youth. And so the bill made it through the committee. Next slide, please. Then the bill passed both chambers, both the House and the Senate, which was incredibly exciting. And I think that this has a lot to do with the fact that youth in the group, including myself, mobilized. We had over 150 youth for a Youth Day of Action, where this was really one of our priorities to tell our legislators that climate education is something we want for the future of Maine. Next slide. And so after the bill went through the appropriations table, the Appropriations Committee, we were so privileged that the bill was awarded $2 million of funding. So now we have a grant program in Maine. We've had 2 iterations of this grant program where teachers are applying for money to seek professional development support around climate education that they will then take back to their classrooms and just build up climate literacy in Maine. I think youth were indispensable to this success, but also just building a grassroots space, having research that backed this really important legislation, and just having community as well. Here's my contact information, and I look forward to the rest of the conversation.
And yes, thank you everyone for joining us, and panelists. It's so great to be meeting you and having this conversation. Alex, if you can go on to the next slide. I'll introduce myself and tell you a little bit about my work and dive straight in. So like Alex mentioned, my name is Geetanjali. I'm talking to you today from College Station, Texas. And I run an organization called Geetanjali Learning Design that works with organizations to design learning and ways that we can engage people in education for sustainable development. And one of the main approaches I like to use in my work to inform it is systems thinking. So what I want to share with you today are some reflection and ideas for how we can use systems thinking in environmental education to create more meaningful and numerous opportunities for civic engagement with the people that we work with, whether they're youth or community members or other adults, or even framing our own work. So next slide, please, Alex. So one thing that I believe about environmental education, and I'd love to see some reactions to know if you agree with me, is that most of the issues we want to work on are complex, right? Like things like deforestation, things like water quality, climate justice, climate change. These are complex issues, and we sometimes have a big challenge in getting people to talk about these issues and engage with them because they can feel intimidating. So one strategy that I've used, and I imagine some of you have used as well, is storytelling to try and make these issues personal and give people some ideas for how they can get involved. So for example, I have this little diagram on a slide of a little story about plastic pollution in the ocean. So we have a person out in the world who litters. They throw their trash on the ground, and maybe it gets into local waterways, and somehow litter like a plastic bag will end up in an ocean where something like wildlife will eat it and get really sick. This seems like a familiar story, I imagine, and it can be really impactful in that it elicits an emotional response from people and gets them wanting to do something. Plus, stories like this give a couple of specific ways people can get involved. So if you want to do something, you can target that person littering and try to get them to stop, or you can target plastic litter and change it, and that will impact the turtle. But that's just a small piece of the situation. As you can see through this animation, there's actually a much more complex story that we can tell. And this lets us to expand our thinking. So in this diagram, you can see that it's not just one thing leading to another. There's a whole array of causes and effects happening. So that person littering isn't just doing so out of the blue. They're doing so because of systemic factors that are influencing them, like laws and policies, industry standards, social norms, their deeply held beliefs and mindsets. And those things also impact if we use plastic and how we think about wildlife. So this diagram is another story that also creates more opportunities for engagement, because now people have 6, 7 different places to intervene. They can do something at any one of these points, which allows us to bring more people into our conversations and give them more options for getting civically engaged with strategies that appeal to their strengths and interests. I want to acknowledge, though, this diagram looks messier than the simple 3-part one I showed you. And that's because these issues are complex. A lot of environmental issues are messy. And while we might not be afraid of getting messy as environmental educators, maybe we're used to going out and getting in the dirt and getting in the field, that can feel intimidating for some people. We're not used to thinking that way, and it can be scary. So if you'll go to the next slide, that's where I want to share something else with you. And these are systems thinking tools. So in our world, we have lots of tools we can use to allow us to explore systems, whether it's reflecting on our own work or engaging youth or community members in our work to find ways they can engage. Systems thinking is a way of looking at the world that emphasizes the dynamic interconnectedness of all the elements around us. And since that can be messy, these tools help make it make more sense. So there's tons of tools out there. I'm not going to go into detail about all of these, but I'll highlight a couple of quick ones that I love. So in the bottom left is the sustainability compass, which is a really good tool for helping to show the connections between nature and human systems, so we don't forget how interrelated they are. In the top middle are causal loop diagrams, which are kind of like that turtle plastic bag one I just showed you. They help us think about nonlinear world around us so we can find multiple points to get involved. And if that feels too messy, the bottom right connection circle is a nice tool to kind of contain some of that, to help people develop their comfort with that messiness and thinking about complex challenges, all of which help us find places to intervene. And you can use these tools in a lot of different ways in your work. On the next slide, I want to tell you a little bit about something I've recently done. So my background is as a teacher. I used to teach high school social studies. And about 10 years ago, when I was teaching high school, I wanted to engage my students with complex issues, teaching geography and history, and I discovered systems thinking. I started volunteering with a nonprofit called Compass Education, which focuses on teaching systems thinking skills and mindsets to cultivate a more sustainable world. And actually today, one of the roles I play is as education program manager for them, working on training other teachers to bring more systems thinking into their classes. So through the funding of the Sea Change Fellowship from NAAE, which looks at the intersection of climate education and civic engagement, I was just over the past couple of months able to run a 3-part virtual training for educators from around North America to talk about bringing more climate education and civic engagement into their existing curriculum. On the next slide, I have a couple of examples for you. just of an issue that I think, show me in the emojis if this resonates with you, a lot of schools think about food and food waste, I think, when they're trying to find things they can do to adjust their engagement with the community, becoming more sustainable, have a less of a carbon footprint. Yeah. So with the teachers in this training, we thought about food. On the left is an example of a teacher who used the sustainability compass, which helps us remember the natural and human worlds are interconnected, thinking about food justice in their community and how the Missoula Food Bank, where they lived, could help to fight for food justice. So every box represents an idea that they could explore or learn more about to better understand how they could support the food bank. And the arrows show how those are all connected, so they could find somewhere they could target that's really connected to get involved and make a difference through civic action. On the right is another tool called the systems iceberg, which is really great for helping to unpack how the everyday events we see are actually the results of systemic factors. We use this tool to brainstorm ways that a school could more actively engage in responsible consumption and production of food. So every post-it represents an idea of something a teacher, a student, or a school could be doing to try and change their school system to be more sustainable regarding food. And last but not least, on the next slide, just one more quick example from my own experience teaching 9th grade geography a few years ago. On the left, if you go to the next slide, please, is a little map from a 9th grade student thinking about sustainable cities and how we could create more sustainable cities. So it looks messy, it's complex, but this student was able to think about resource management, different kinds of economic and human systems and how they all interact to find some leverage points in a city, things they could target and get involved with to really try and make a city more sustainable. And so even though it's messy, life is messy, cities are complex. We have to deal with that. So giving tools to help us, our community members, find ways to deal with this can be really helpful. In conclusion, on my last slide, I just want to share with you a quote that I think encapsulates how systems thinking can help us engage more people in civic work. You are not Atlas carrying the world on your shoulders. It's good to remember the planet is carrying you. I think this quote from Vandana Shiva really emphasizes the interconnectedness of our world. And if we're dealing with that messy reality, one way we can involve more people is to make that reality more accessible through tools. So there's a link here to Compass Education, which does free training and resources on systems thinking tools that I mentioned if you want to learn more about them. And feel free to reach out to me as well if you want to chat more about how you might use systems thinking in your work. Thank you.
Yeah, hello. Wow, that was really exciting. It's kind of fun. All of your presentations have kind of like amped me up a little bit. So my mind might be like thinking about everything y'all presented. So I'm going to try and focus up here. But hello, everyone. My name is Taylor Ruff, and I'm a program manager at EarthForce. I'm based in Denver, Colorado. And so we really like to emphasize environmental action civics. It's a model that empowers students to address local environmental issues through civic engagement. And so go to that next slide, please. We'll kind of talk a little bit more about us, and our desire to increase youth participation in environmental decision making. So what we do is we provide, customizable tools, resources, professional development opportunities, trainings, one-on-one coaching as well, to help adults, educators of all types, organizations create these spaces for young people to form youth-adult partnerships and engage in environmental problem finding and problem solving through civic action. And so, next slide, please. And so what is environmental action civics? It's kind of a term that we've coined, and it's really for students to share power with adults, practice the democratic decision-making process, address local environmental problems or issues using civics. And really we would like that co-creation, that partnership element. So that is where I come in Colorado. I work with educators of all kinds or organizations that serve youth that are really interested in taking that content or knowledge of their, environmental education to that next step, and like getting it to action is kind of that messy place that we have all this information that all of my fellow panelists are providing. Like, look at all this research, look at all this information that we have. And at EarthForce, we try and utilize this environmental civic action process to create a framework to co-create and develop strategies to take action that is inherently student-led. So it provides that skill and that empowerment for those young folks to carry through their life. So next slide, please. And so why is civics important in environmental education? And so really to cultivate engaged citizens. And now I really want to emphasize language that we use. And I know sometimes the term citizen is a charged term. We kind of utilize it. It means different things to different folks, but we are really referring to engaged citizens as an individual that is connected and empowered to work collaboratively with their fellow community members or community organizations to address challenges that they all face. And that's a really big emphasis on engagement or a commitment to helping their community achieve their goals. And so in this case, as environmental educators, it's addressing these environmental issues that my panelists or we all experience in our day-to-day. And a lot of those issues really intersect. And I think Gitanjali really talked about the complexity of these things and how hard it is to approach them. And that's why at Earth Force, we really focus on those local things, those smaller community elements to address environmental issues and take action on something that is a bit smaller, especially when we're working with young folks, maybe in middle school or high school. It makes it a little bit more approachable. But with some of these activities, it can kind of, act locally, think globally. So we're learning about these greater issues, but we have the empowerment and capability to act within our local community. And that really focuses on that collective action, working together, not only finding problems or issues, but also leveraging those strengths. And I think some of my other panelists talk about, like, let's not just go look at all what's wrong, but also look at what is good. So I'm going to dive a little bit into our process in a moment, but why it's important in EE is to really create those engaged citizens, address environmental issues, to take action, as well as improve educator and student experiences and outcomes. Because when we have those experiences of collective action, it kind of gives us those warm and fuzzies, and it provides the skills and the skill building, the empowerment to kind of want to do it again, even if the process is significantly challenging. I think we've all experienced that. Here's just some interesting evaluation measures that we've had, when we talk about building environmental citizens or strengthening civic participation, that in our work, 91% of students meet with school or community leaders to ask for change or to help co-create that action. And so in our process, it really emphasizes young folks engaging with all of the individuals in their community to gain a better understanding of the issue, not only just the people that can make decisions or have power over issues, but also those individuals that are most impacted by those issues. And they can be two different folks. And so gaining all those perspectives really helps create a holistic view to create a systemic change. And so those are just some great little evaluative measures that we like to highlight when we work with youth, we work with adults to amplify those things. And so next, I really want to talk about, the Earth Force process, or the environmental action civics process. It is a 6-step process that kind of helps scaffold this experience, starting with investigating your community, choosing your issue, researching that issue, choosing a strategy, taking action, and then celebrating. So in those 6 steps, that seems pretty simple, but actually it can be very challenging. So honestly, I think this next infographic helps highlight the process a little bit more, and I'll go into a little bit more depth about that. So Alex, can you give me the next slide, please? So this is much more iterative of what the process can look like when you conduct it with your students or whatever youth that you serve. And so really that first step is investigating and identifying strengths and weaknesses within the defined community that you set with your students. So especially for middle school or high school students and that age range, a school campus is a great place to start, or maybe the greater neighborhood. And that investigation in that space, because that's where they live, that's where they conduct their lives. So a good example would just be walking around, taking a walk, or having a conversation about what your daily life is, so that you can maybe pinpoint things to be like, this is something I experience every day that I would like to see changed. And so I work with a group here in the Denver metro area. They did this investigation, And they had a few different things that came to mind. They saw litter, they saw a lack of shade trees, they saw a lack of outdoor equipment or equipment that was decrepit. And so they had this list of things like every day. It doesn't make me feel great coming to school because of these things. Excuse me. And so we had that list, and then we engage in that second step. And so we have this conversation or a decision-making process, a conversation, maybe debate. Maybe one set of students really is interested in this litter issue, or maybe the other set of students really wants to tackle the lack of shade trees. And they can engage in that conversation of like, all right, we would like to collectively do this. But through that process, they actually split into two committees since they were so engaged and enthusiastic. Like, all right, we can tackle both of these things simultaneously as long as you all kind of collaborate. So that's kind of that decision-making, democratic decision-making process that we emphasize. And once they've selected an issue, going into the research phase, and that step 3 is a pretty robust step where you're investigating policies or community practices surrounding that issue. And so that's a whole thing. I want to move on to the community engagement piece because I don't want to take up too much time. Because in step 3, we're engaging with community members or organizations as well. So who are those individuals in your community that are already addressing those issues? They could be school administration or operations and custodial staff. And those people. So in that process, they're either writing letters or setting meetings and talking about it, saying, this is the issue we're investigating. We're really interested in seeing some change. And then they can co-create solutions and develop a list of strategies that they would like to take. And so with all of that information, students then kind of reconvene, continue to go through a decision-making process again and select the ideal strategy, because we have these issues are very complex. They might have multiple strategies to action, but we can only do so much in, say, a programmatic cycle or a school year. So with those students, we're like, all right, what is the most effective thing we can do in this moment? And that strategy selection really helps pinpoint it and setting criteria for that. What's the budget? What's the time? What of our strengths? What in our community can we leverage to make this happen? And so that conversation in step 4 helps students select it and then take that action. But life can be messy, so you can still select that strategy and start implementing that action and hit some barriers. And so that is why you have that little dotted line that might send you back to step 3. So in my kind of shade tree analogy, those students were engaging with school administration, operations staff, and they ran into a barrier that the school administration didn't want to plant trees because they were experiencing a lot of vandalism of new trees that they were experiencing. So now they have this new issue that they didn't really think about, that now this is our new problem. This is our new issue. Maybe we need to go back and do some additional research, maybe get some additional resources or expertise to then be able to move through the process. So that is a very brief overview of this process. And so my work is cooperating, coaching and working with educators of all kinds throughout Colorado to take their students through this process. And so you're welcome to go to earthforce.org. All of these resources and information is free to use. And I see Alex is sharing all kinds of fun stuff in the chat about EarthForce because, we've got Environmental Action Civics Week this week. So if you're interested in seeing some student examples, my colleague Sarah in the Chesapeake Bay area is hosting her finals for the Caring for Our Watersheds program. And so check out that website, register for some other events going on at EarthForce for our Environmental Civic Action Week if you want to learn more. So thank you all so much. Now I want to get to the conversation.
Thank you so much to all the presenters for your very thoughtful, useful ideas. Now we can go to the discussion part. I'd like to begin by a question for Taylor and Gitangeli about why do you think it may be beneficial for environmental education programs involve students and adults and communities in different types of civic engagement, such as policy making, and more direct and hands-on stewardship. Maybe you can comment based on your experience with youth or based on your work with professional development of environmental educators.
I think policy or regulation is like they're the rules that we're supposed to be following, but we don't always follow the rules we set for ourselves. And so that's where we can enter that process with students to be like, well, we are seeing this issue in our community as it relates to our environment. You know, the policy, the rules are this, but these individuals aren't following it. So then you kind of cross into the community practice, the behavior change, which is even more challenging. And so it helps amplify the complexity and engage and try and actually create a more holistic strategy. So then what is the strategy? If regulation or policy really isn't getting it done, how can we engage with our community members to make a behavior change, which is really challenging. And I don't think we have the answers to that yet. But I think that's why it's important, because that's where that stewardship piece comes in as well, because then you can have, you know, community of practice or behavior change where communities can engage with certain elements of stewardship, and you can change behavior based on those experiences, and then maybe some additional policy. So that's my initial reaction. And I'm really interested in what my fellow panelists would say.
I'd like to hop in there, Taylor, and say I agree with you completely. I think that one thing you mentioned that I'm thinking about is this reciprocal relationship between individual agency and empowerment to be stewards of our environment and of our world, and policy. They have to work together. You can't have just one or the other. Policies impact us as individuals, especially I work with a lot of teachers, right? So teachers need support. They have too much on their plate already. They need policies to do things like what I believe Emily was talking about with, like, there's no training in New York. You wanted to get training, you wanted to get more. You need policies to make stuff like that happen. But you also need communities of practice, like Taylor said. You need structures that we've heard from our other panelists that build agency and individual empowerment so they can go advocate for things. So it's a reciprocal relationship. It's a like causal loop, right? They impact each other, and we need both of them. And different people are going to have different strengths. So some people will be really great and ready to go engage with policymakers. Like Amara, your story is amazing to me, the way you just took initiative and went for it. And other people, that might not be their strength, they're where they're at right now. And there's other things they can do in their community. So you need different levels to engage.
Thank you so much. And now I'd like to ask Amara, Emily, and Oliver about civic engagement indicators. What kind of indicators can or should environmental education programs use to learn about their own success in fostering civic engagement?
I think an indicator is, of course, like a legislative or like maybe a municipal ordinance, like success. But the reality of like policy and advocacy is that success isn't realized for multiple years, and there has to be continued advocacy efforts for that. I am in the camp that civic engagement is incredibly and inherently relational. And I think if students have better relationships with, or even know, you know, who their legislators are, who their school board is made up of, who serves on their town council, that will only serve them so much in their advocacy efforts, but just in life in general, because they'll know, okay, I know that this is my legislator and this is an issue I'm passionate about, even if it's 10 years along the line. I know that I can go and talk to this person, and that person is in charge of being a conduit for my voice and the voice of the community. So identifiable relationships, I think, is a wonderful indicator.
Yeah, I think that, you know, just getting students engaged in their democratic process is so new for many students. Getting them to register to vote. You know, I think that once they start getting involved with something that's new, they realize the possibilities and they recognize that they have agency. And, you know, agency is the antidote to anxiety. And so, you know, the more students get involved, I feel like they not only form bonds, you know, in a community, but they feel like they're not alone, and they feel like they also have the ability to make change. And so that ability to know that you can participate in your, you know, democratic institutions, that you have the ability to travel to your state capital and speak to the people that you elected, and that work for you because you pay their salaries. You know, getting to understand those basic structures really, I think, motivates kids to stay engaged. And so I got a wonderful quote this morning that I was hoping I could read from one of our students, Sugan, who's in Long Island. And he basically said that that he's a sophomore in high school now, and that that engaging in these important conversations with these state legislators and policy experts advocating for the integration of climate education in school curriculums has not only allowed him to contribute to the dialogue surrounding these critical issues, but also provided him with valuable opportunities to develop leadership and communication skills, broadening his own understanding of the complex challenges and potential solutions surrounding climate change. So I think that's kind of like, you know, we collect these testimonials from students as a way to measure whether, you know, students are being impacted by their involvement with us. And it's really heartening to hear those types of, you know, responses, because it means that this type of civic engagement is really having an impact on students and their confidence in engaging in, you know, participatory democracy.
Yeah, so I'll come in and kind of I want to push it a little bit farther actually, because I mean, Emily mentioned agency, and I think that that's a key indicator. Connected to that is a sense of self-efficacy, which is connected to that point I made earlier about this growing gap between people who feel politically rich and people who feel politically poor. Those who feel that they know how the system works, how to navigate the corridors of power, how to access the spaces and the actors that exercise influence, and those who don't and who are marginalized, excluded, etc. And kind of understanding to what extent children and young people feel politically rich or feel politically poor is really important. But, you know, one of the one of the dirtiest secrets in politics, I'm a political scientist, so I come at this, one of the dirtiest secrets is that politicians need help and they just don't want to admit it. Right? They are really struggling. Legislators, policymakers, not just politicians, all kinds of policymakers, right? Now, who's going to provide that help? We spent the last few decades thinking that an alliance between elites and experts was going to do it. That didn't do it, right? So we need citizens in the frame. We need children and young people involved. So let me give you just a super quick story about that example I mentioned earlier about the Scottish Climate Assembly. This started in the Scottish Parliament. So traditional politicians recognizing that they needed help, and there was a climate change piece of legislation. And as part of that, they created a citizens' assembly. 100 members of the Scottish population randomly selected so that all kinds of people will be involved with all levels of education, all socioeconomic backgrounds, age, ethnicity, etc. But that was not all, and this is the important bit. It was not enough because the assembly was formed by people who were 16 and over, and we wanted children and young people involved. So we involved something called the Children's Parliament, and these were children from 8 to 16 years old, and they became an absolutely crucial part of the Scottish Climate Assembly that then fed back into the Scottish Parliament. So here we have a new civic institution where children and young people are not just knocking on the doors of legislators and advocating. That is really, really important. We need more of that. But we also need to recognize that we need to expand who we consider to be the legislators and the decision makers, because our traditional political figures are really struggling and they need help. And I think that that's where a lot of this new understanding of civic engagement as expanding the power to co-legislate, co-produce, co-design, co-develop is going to be crucial.
Thank you. Now we can go to questions submitted by the attendees of this panel. And we've got more than 200 questions, and many of them are focused on the idea of equity. How do we make sure, in general, how do we make sure that environmental education programs are including everyone in this process of education towards civic engagement?
I mean, I can jump in and just quickly say that we engage students. I love what Oliver said about the Children's Parliament. At the same time, we hear from students that they don't want to bear the burden of having to do all of the change making by themselves because they feel that they didn't create the problems that they've been burdened with. So support for students is really critical. But I think adult support of youth leadership is critical. And one of the ways we've supported that is to engage students in drafting legislation and then going and fighting for that legislation. So giving youth leadership opportunities and opportunities to exercise their power. So
Thank you,
Yeah,
Emily.
just to chime in briefly, definitely agree with the things that Emily said. And I think when we're thinking about the climate crisis, folks have already mentioned on this panel how it's a weighty issue, and there's more research coming around around the social emotional ramifications that youth face due to learning about this issue without having concrete actionable steps towards I would say self-determination and feeling like they too can take charge. And so I think it's just really ensuring that folks complement their education with environmental action civics, which is a wonderful model for leading work in your community. And when you lead work in your community and it is local, there's more of a chance that you'll see tangible benefits that will only, I guess, spur you to continue forward in those efforts.
Thank you,
Can I,
Oliver. Yeah,
if I
go
could
ahead.
just add just an observation as well. I think, the kind of change that current generations and future generations are going to have to drive is going to really require a different understanding of power. And a lot of us grew up with a zero-sum understanding of power. And I have a lot of conversations with people in power who feel, okay, if we do more civic engagement, if we have a more engaged, active citizenship, I'm losing power and I'm here to get things done, often for the right reasons, sometimes not, but and if I share power, I lose power. And this is a fundamental misunderstanding of how power works, because sometimes when you share power, you generate power that wasn't there before. So power is generative, not just a zero sum. A quick example, is another democratic innovation, participatory budgeting, which is a way of allocating public funds by involving citizens directly. Now, sometimes these are funds that were allocated by someone in a back room, a small committee behind closed doors, in a black box, that kind of situation of decision making. PB, participatory budgeting, opens that up. And all of a sudden you unleash the energy of all kinds of community groups, of schools, of all kinds of civic institutions. And you mobilize energy, resources, motivation, aspiration, etc., that wasn't there before. So you're generating new power to get things done. And this is going to be crucial to climate action that is effective.
Thank you.
I'd like to jump in with just
Go
one
ahead.
really quick thing. I would encourage you, if you're working with students from different socioeconomic backgrounds or demographic backgrounds, to look at the sphere of influence model. Everyone has things in their sphere of control, their sphere of influence, and then other things they're concerned about. And by providing multiple access points for engaging with civic education, like not just making there be one thing, using a process like the Earthworth process or some of the other things people have talked about, provide multiple ways that people can engage, and everyone has something in their sphere of influence they can do, even if it's different.
Okay, and we received also very many questions from participants who ask, how should we design environmental education programs in such a way that engage students of different ages into civic engagement? Maybe what are different approaches for young kids and for older students, as well as for community members and adults?
I can jump in because we have this model where we have our task force, which has adult members from all different backgrounds, and then we have a youth steering committee, which is separate, and they have created their own e-board where they self-govern and they meet on their own. But then we have opportunities where we bring the two groups together, where it's a public meeting and a public space, and the students can facilitate or co-facilitate with adults, and we bring them together to interact with each other, like in the lobby days. So we have these two separate spaces where adults can have their own space and youth can have their own space, but we provide opportunities for them to meld and come together.
Yeah. With Earth Force, we really emphasize as much as possible and like challenge by choice, because every community is different. Every group of students is different. They all have strengths. And I think that's why we work with adults to kind of help that facilitation piece, to kind of let them step at least one step out of a particular comfort zone to grow. Because it's that idea of either talking with that individual in power, that's very scary. And it's kind of that facilitation and being that adult ally is really important. So for me, it's as much as is possible as when you are working with your students. And I think I work with a lot of classroom educators, and they have remarkable relationships with their students, and they know their capacity and also their potential. So that's another really great thing to be like, I know you can do this, and I'm here to help you accomplish that. So each group is different, is what I would say, but then trying your best to really unlock that potential and those strengths of those students so that they are engaging as much as they possibly can.
I
Go ahead.
wonder if I may add just a small one. Sorry, this is just too tempting. There's something. There's something that is incredible that we are at the time we find ourselves in, and yet children and young people remain excluded from decision-making processes, institutions. I think it's the last accepted exclusion, because we know there are many exclusions, but no one would accept exclusion on the basis of gender or anything else. Yet we accept exclusion on the basis of age, and it's quite terrible, especially given that we are looking to a future that might be bringing very different scenarios for people. So, the one key lesson from the interaction between the Children's Parliament and the Scottish Climate Assembly and the Scottish Parliament is that the children were the ones that brought to the Assembly process the most forward-thinking measures, to the point that initially the Scottish Climate Assembly was going to be just producing a report from the adults, but they were so taken and so persuaded by the input from the children involved, that in the end, the recommendations of this official new civic institution have side by side the adults and the children. And the adults in the assembly made the point that it was the children that emboldened there to take forward some of the 81 recommendations that they put forward that were quite radical in terms of climate action. So, I think it's time to begin to just change that and include children and young people in these processes. But that's not going to be easy. And here we're talking a lot about teaching, education, but perhaps one of the most important challenges is going to be unlearning. How do we teach people like ourselves, adults, to unlearn the habits of a lifetime of doing democracy in a particular way?
Thank you. And another type of questions we received is how environmental education can foster civic engagement, not only by involving students with policy making and elected officials, but also with different other types of institutions and businesses and other branches of the government.
Yeah, I think issue framing is really important. I think that's also like a very loaded like academic term. I'll say instead like storytelling is very important. The way that folks convey their story, the way that they convey the thing that they're advocating for is super important in having other sectors be involved and be engaged. I'll give an example and say that something that I've primarily seen in the United States, and we're really trying to make a push in Maine, is around green schools. And this is a holistic school model that supports sustainability and decarbonization efforts along with education. And so in having really school administrators, superintendents, and school boards, facilities managers see the importance of green schools, of decarbonization, of climate literacy and education. I feel like an important story to tell is around cost savings. A lot of schools are really bearing the brunt of the energy crisis, and we have really high energy costs in Maine. And so there's testimonies of schools across the country who have transitioned into more sustainable energy sources, saved money, and then actually turned that out to their teachers, to their curriculum plans, and just benefited their students more. So it really comes down to ensuring that you speak to your audience in a way that they'll most understand you. I don't believe in manipulating one story and changing one story. I don't think there's any value in that. But what I do believe is meeting people where they're at and sharing the story that resonates most with them.
Yeah, I'd love to jump in and agree with Amara so much on that idea of meeting people where they're at and trying to figure out what's the avenue for communicating. And I want to build on that to tie into Oliver's point that he's been making so eloquently about reimagining the way that we think about education and reimagining some of our mindsets that trap us in our current systems. If we can think more systemically, we can see that schools aren't separate from our communities, like our businesses, our other organizations that we have, food banks, like community organizations, governance, it's all interconnected. So in different ways, how can we reimagine the way students are interacting with community members and how businesses might serve as learning ventures and learning opportunities for students? What kind of partnerships are we building between adults and youth? What opportunities do we have for them to meet each other, ask questions, share perspectives, for students to advocate, not just in parliaments, which sounds amazing, but like at local, say, business meetings every Wednesday. In the town where I live, we have meetings every Wednesday where like local business leaders come together and talk about ideas. Could students be there? Are there other ways that you can create these kinds of connections that aren't within the confines of school, that either can be bringing people in or sending kids out, depending on what your school capacity is, or if you're not in a school and your environmental education organization, how do you build those kind of cross-community connections?
Thank you for your additional insights and experiences. And I'd like to finish this panel, perhaps just with one sentence from each panelist about maybe some tangible, practical recommendations for environmental educators or any important observations from today's panel. And we will go in this order.
Sure. I would reiterate that don't be afraid to get messy when looking for opportunities for engagement based on all the examples we've heard and what you're seeing in your own community.
I'll just underscore what I actually just put in the chat. Outdoor learning, climate education, civic engagement, they're all inseparable. They're all super linked. It comes down to like what is age appropriate, and also what will allow youth to like build a love and a passion for the outdoors. It's exploring in the environment when they're younger that will transcend into advocacy and environmental stewardship as they grow older.
And I like to always emphasize the element of like relationship building, trust building, that like this work cannot be done alone or individually. So we talk about collective action. So engaging with those individuals, both professionally and personally within the communities you live in, and then elevating those young folks as well, is what I'd like to end with.
Yeah, and I would say engage youth in all aspects of society and give them opportunities, support them, especially emotionally through this crisis that we're living through, lift them up, and get them to question what they're learning in school and advocate for something better because they deserve quality climate education that prepares them for the future that they're going to be growing into.
So for me, and it's been brilliant. I've learned so much from everyone here. So thank you. And for me, I guess I come back to that, how important it's going to be that children and young people, that will help them and ourselves understand that politics is more than party politics, that democracy is more than electoral democracy, that democracy is a way of life, and democracy is always under development, that it should be part of all our relationships. And if we do that, then we'll start to treat each other not just as adversaries, not just as bystanders or spectators, but as problem solvers, co-producers, collaborators, as we try to grapple with these most difficult of challenges. But I'm hopeful because I get to spend a lot of time with communities, and I know a lot of people out there are involved in real change making, although sadly that storytelling doesn't make it enough into mainstream media.
Thank you to all the panelists and everyone who attended this panel today. I think we all learned something very important about the overlap and interaction between environmental education and civic engagement. So thank you so much to all the panelists, and thank you to all environmental educators and community leaders who joined us today. We very much appreciate your contribution and your very important work through environmental education and civic engagement.